Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the September Marketing Communications Center chat. I'm Alex Parkinson. I'm your host for these Marketing Communications Center chats. I'm also the Communications Institute co-leader at the conference board. Today's webcast is entitled How Marketers Can Capitalize on Inflection Points in Business. We thank you all for joining us, and I'm also joined by my colleague JP Coolvine, who is a co-leader of the Communications Institute with me and Marketing Institute leader. And he'll be interviewing today best-selling author and Columbia Business School professor Rita McGrath. Rita has a new book out called Seeing Around Corners, How to Spot Inflection Points in Business Before They Happen. And that will be the primary basis for today's discussion, but JP and Rita will also go into some of her previous work as well. With that, I think that is everything that I needed to go through. There we are again on the PowerPoint deck there, but you'll see us all in person as the video starts streaming. So I am going to hand over now to JP Coolvine, who is going to lead us through his conversation with Rita. JP, over to you.
All right, thank you, Alex, and thanks to Rita to be here. Rita, as Alex said, is an author. She's an advisor, and she is a professor at Columbia University. She certainly is an expert in the area of strategy and innovation, particularly developing such strategies and innovations in uncertain environments. Does that feel familiar? And just to prove the point, let me quote, Thinker 50 gave her the #1 award for strategy and the Distinguished Achievement Award. So they think she does a fantastic job. She's been named one of the 25 smartest women to follow on Twitter by Fast Company. And I love that one. And certainly very active. She also has a column, The Entrepreneurial Strategist in Inc. magazine, but also publishes a lot in Harvard Business Review. So choose your medium. You will come across Rita if you're interested in strategy. One of the interesting things, she's not new to this, but she started at the age of 12. So one of her seminal works, for example, is Discovery-Driven Planning in 1995, which is more or less a precursor, if you like, of Lean Startup, which is something very much discussed today. So Rita has been there right from the inception when it comes to groundbreaking strategies and ways to strategize and execute. When talking about books, and Alex has already talked about the latest one, I want to just call out 3 of her best-selling and award-winning books. One, Discovery-Driven Growth, which we'll talk about a bit because it's very relevant today. And I think she'll probably tell us that her latest book builds on that one as well as The End of Competitive Advantage, which I'm interested to hear whether she still thinks or even more thinks that that's the case today. And then finally, the book Alex quoted, which is Seeing Around Corners, which is brand new. The subtitle is How to Spot Inflection Points in Business Before They Happen. So hopefully we'll get to talk about a couple of ways to foresee those inflection points. But first of all, talked a lot. Thank you very much first to join us. Where are you joining us from? You're very busy right now launching this new book.
I am indeed. At the moment, I am in Boston.
Wonderful. I think, is it consulting? Is it book presenting? Is it working with a university? Because you seem to do all of these constantly.
I do. So today, during the day, it's quite a lot of conversations like this one. And this evening, KPMG Boston is sponsoring a book launch event. So they're hosting me here. And they've been very kind to lend me an office for the day. So I'm not holed up in a hotel room somewhere. So that's nice. Last night we had an alumni. Last night we had an alumni event with Columbia Business School alumni at the Education First building here, which is a pretty impressive location in Cambridge. And then before that, I was in Toronto. And before that, I was at Purdue University. And before that, I was at Governor State. So it's a big week for the book.
See, I didn't exaggerate. I wanted you to say it. Now, one of the red herrings or common threads around your books is that you like to dive into strategy and plan development and execution in what at Procter & Gamble we called, and I think at the Army actually, is called a VUCA world, a world that's volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. Why would you choose those very stressed environments as the area you want to dive in? What's the motivation behind that?
Well, I think they're inherently more interesting than environments where everything is stable. And since I've always been interested in innovation and change, those kinds of environments really are where things are changing and where innovation is required. The other thing I think that's valuable to note is that those environments more and more are characterized where we have to forge our own competitive destinies. And so I think it's being a little bit ahead of the curve to work there.
Right. In fact, I looked at a wonderful summary of your discovery-driven growth book, which was really seminal in 2009, and you summarized it at one point as the only plan is to learn as you go. Do you mean by that in this uncertain environments, processes, long-term planning, you should throw all of that out and just act intuitively?
Well, I think strategy becomes more important than ever because you can't waste resources, unnecessarily. And so, you need to be fairly careful about the choices that you make, and strategy is really what informs those choices. I think you can make directional plans, but I think the specifics are things you kind of have to learn in the moment. So I think the idea of having a point of view about the future and having a sense of when you want to take action is really critical. I don't think that the big playbooks we used to have with 5 years plans with charts and graphs and things, they used to use back in the 70s. I don't think that's the way that people do things anymore. But I do think it's important to give people a unifying sense of direction. So, a great example of this would be what Satya Nadella is doing at Microsoft. He said, look, we need to focus on leading indicators of the future. And a leading indicator for our business as we migrate away from desktop solutions to the cloud is going to be usage. He's very, very interested in usage. And he says, before I can get usage, customers have to want to use our products. So a leading indicator of the things that will drive profits and success down the road are things like customer love. I mean, can you imagine Microsoft talking about customer love? But, directionally, he's sort of fleshed that out.
Not under previous regimes.
Previous regimes, that would not have been the philosophy. But what he's done is he's then, within that broad customer love theme, he's allowed the individual teams to have quite a lot of latitude about how they express that. And he's been very supportive of their trying things, even if they don't completely work out the first time. He's been super helpful about supporting them in that.
And he's been pretty firm on strategy choices. I think in one of your books, and honestly, I forgot in which one you described that, Microsoft chose, for example, to jettison the mobile-based business just because they didn't see a win in that and changed on that. You also say that the environment where you can assume to be right, particularly for a medium or longer term, is over. And what you need to do is assume to be wrong. Do particularly the startups everyone talks today and the famous pivot, is that what it's all about, to be ready at any moment to make even sharp turns and adjust your strategy?
I think yes, because things change in the environment. For example, 6 months ago, everybody thought Juul, the electronic cigarette company, was worth billions. I mean, there were something like $14.4 billion invested in what's essentially a startup. And here we are 6 months later, we've got the FDA raising concerns. People are, showing dire health effects of vaping. We've got reports that underage users are just exploding, that some phenomenal number of 16-year-olds, for example, have experimented with vaping. So that's a completely different world that you need to be prepared for. So we've just seen their CEO step down. the strategy that's gotten them to here is definitely not going to be the strategy that's going to work in a harsher regulatory environment. And you couldn't have necessarily predicted that 6 months ago.
Right. And if it seems straightforward to think of 5 people in a garage pivoting, but when you're an oil tanker like General Motors, General Mills, or Procter & Gamble, how do you pivot an oil tanker? Do you have like one nugget there where you say one of the most important things for these big giants that they're not currently doing is this?
Well, I think it comes down to how you manage your portfolios. And let me take a specific example to illustrate how I think that works. So if you take Nike, right? I mean, that's certainly a multi-billion-dollar global clothing enterprise along the scale of a P&G or a General Motors. What they started to do to understand a number of major trends is they have a lot of investments that they make that are in small initiatives, which I would say are at the edges of their organization. So it's not their core business. It's out there where they're kind of experimenting. And so one such experiment that began this was their first foray into a direct-to-consumer digital offering. And back in the day, it was collaborating with Apple to create the Nike plus iPod line of products. And back then it was completely kind of insignificant, but it gave them some insight into how consumers behave. It gave them some ideas about how we can help runners, for example, collaborate and share information and join in motivation and so forth. And so over the years, they've sort of gradually built out more and more of those digital offerings to the point where today, the digital direct-to-consumer part of their sales is about 29%, so just less than a third of their sales. But the thing I think is interesting is the pivoting that they have done. If you look at it, it doesn't seem like a huge, sharp, massive restructuring. And to me, that's part of the science of getting inflection point right, which is you have to be, engaging and experimenting early without making these huge, giant commitments to something before its time is really ready. And that's part of what motivated me to write the book, which is, there's a tendency the minute you see a trend happening to say, oh my God, we've got to, the sky is falling, we've got to make all these changes. When instead, I think the thing to be doing is investing in options, which you can then exercise later on. And if you look at something like a Procter & Gamble, I would say they have some great examples of this kind of thing that started out as a small venture and then eventually became pretty material. Back in the day, their first manual to electric brushes, the spin brush, right, when they acquired this business and then they were able to scale it. And then eventually they had to sell it as part of a merger. But, that was a case where it was a tiny business when they acquired it, and it became one of their fastest selling products. Another one was the Swiffer, which was essentially kind of a diaper on a stick you could use to replace mops. Well, who would have thought of that, right? So in the beginning, it doesn't look as though it's going to be a big deal. And then if you're successful and really figure out where that market is going, you can commercialize it, and it can grow pretty rapidly.
Right. I was in new business development at Procter & Gamble when we introduced Febreze, and similar to Swiffer, it was actually a product that failed 3 times in market, and then just on intuition, I would say, it was pushed into market, saying we just have to try it. It reminds me of 2 principles in your latest book, Seeing Around Corners, which is number one, that these inflection points, they might feel like all of a sudden they happen, particularly if you do not apply some of these strategies of implementing foresight mechanics in your operations. But in reality, they are a long time coming, as you describe it in the book, and there are ways to kind of foresee them. And the second one, I think, towards the end of the principles, which is there are ways to live the future today. Can you talk about these 2 particularly? How do I live the future today?
Well, so William Gibson, who's a science fiction writer, is very famous for saying the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed yet. And what he meant by that was that there are always pieces of something that's going to become consequential, but in the early stages, it doesn't look like anything in particular. And so one of the things that I think all of us can do is think a little bit about, well, where could I go and see bits and pieces of the future starting to happen? So as an example for myself, I attend a lot of conferences, such as the Business of Software conference. I was just there at the beginning of the month. And that's where people who are actually creating the future come. You know, these are companies with brand new kinds of applications. For example, there was a guy there with a totally different way of thinking about email using cutting edge technologies. There's a company there that is looking at different kinds of storage. There were some companies playing around with virtual reality. There's a very interesting social networking company called 1 Second a Day, which has been in business for about 9 years, but their emphasis is on visual communication. It's very short. You capture 1 second of your life every day, and then you can knit them together into sort of blogs or reports or whatever, and people are finding that sort of thing really attractive. So that's not mainstream yet. Those are, by and large, small new companies, but they're part of what could be important in the future. And so I would encourage your listeners to think about, you know, how could I take a little bit of time, not huge amounts of time, but a little bit of time, and think about where are those technologies of the future, where are the future conversations happening? So, you know, if you want to know, for example, what the 20-year-olds of 10 years from now are going to be like, well, guess what? I can tell you with statistical certainty they're all alive today and they're all 10 years old. You know, so you can go talk to them. I'm not saying you're going to be able to make predictions, but you're going to be able to get a sense for what their expectations are and what world is it that they're growing up in, what are the things they're paying attention to, and that can begin to tell you, to give you some insight into what may be material down the road.
Right. Now, in your book, The End of Competitiveness, you talk about sustained competitive advantage being a nice concept, but really being a trap or unrealistic, I think you say, and that you need to have a transient kind of an ever-moving competitive advantage. Could you explain that a little bit? And even as the startups of today, let's say the Uber or the Airbnbs grow, and they grow incredibly because they're trying to get these network effects going and get the flywheel going. So they grow incredibly fast. Even they, it seems, according to your theory or your observations, need to kind of almost destroy themselves in a Schumpeterian way, you know, creative destruction, their own scale model to stay at the cutting edge. How do you achieve that? How can you help a company to kind of destroy its own core business?
Well, I think what you have to be thinking about in the core business is two things. So how do I keep today's core business as fit for purpose as possible? So how do I make sure I've got really good customer interfaces, that I'm easy to do business with, that I'm really picking up on the latest in customer needs. But at the same time, you have to decide what in your core business needs less emphasis. Because, the basic argument behind the end of competitive advantage is that we used to have a world in which to run a large enterprise, you needed to own assets, right? And you needed to invest in technology. You needed to have R&D and patents. And where we are today, and digital is a part of this, but there are other changes too, is increasingly you're able to access assets rather than owning them. And that's had the effect of dropping entry barriers dramatically. And that's had the effect of allowing anything that's successful, unless you've got some really strong way of protecting it, to be copied. And so, as you mentioned, some of the few barriers left are things like network effects. And just to be clear for your listeners, a network effect occurs when the value of an offering increases to the extent that more people are using it. So the classic example would be something like Facebook. The value to advertisers is greater the more people are using Facebook. And the value to other Facebook users is more valuable the more other people are using Facebook. So there's an increasing return almost to the number of users that they've got. Now, I would also say, if you take something like an Uber, and I've been saying this for some time, Uber doesn't really have network effects beyond a certain threshold level. I mean, if I wanted to be the Uber of the Upper West Side of Manhattan, all I'd have to do is take off-the-shelf software from Amazon Web Services, do a little bit of programming, send out a message that could go to all the Uber drivers on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and put my app on the App Store. I mean, there's virtually no competitive barrier to entry. Now, what Uber's trying to tell people is that, because we have this global network, we have powerful network effects. But most people use Uber locally. I mean, there are a few people, business people, maybe that travel all over, that would use Uber globally. But by and large, it's a really local business. So they've had the advantage over local taxi companies of being more convenient and being easier, and in some cases being cheaper, partly because they're subsidized by investor money. But I would argue there's a case where the network effect is probably vulnerable to erosion, especially if they have to go to true market pricing for their rides. Airbnb, in contrast, to me is a much more durable model because by definition, if I'm using an Airbnb, I'm away from home. And so the bigger the network, the more value it has to me as an individual traveler. But where Airbnb, I think, has some vulnerability is if you take, there's a website called Booking.com,
Booking.com,
which is the parent. Sorry?
Bookings.com, for example, I think offers Airbnb rooms now.
Well, here's the thing. So I'm a business traveler, let's say, or even if I'm planning a family holiday. So I can go to individual hotel websites. I can go to the American Express site. I could go to Expedia, and then I can go to Airbnb. Or wouldn't it be so much easier to me if I went to one site that had both Airbnb and hotels and everything else with all the pricing all transparent? That would be so much easier, right? So that's where I see Airbnb as being slightly vulnerable. Now they're trying, they're starting to list hotel rooms as well on their platform. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But even an Airbnb could be vulnerable to the incumbents beginning to respond. We're already seeing Marriott, for example, building out a section of their offering that's involving homestays. Because, Airbnb has taught them now there's a demand for a less expensive home-like environment with washing machines and dishwashers and, all the things people like to have at home that for a certain kind of trip and for a certain kind of segment is much more attractive. So I think the dynamics here are that, the fact that you've demonstrated something successful means other people can copy. And unless you have some kind of barrier to entry, it's going to be very hard to sustain that advantage. So just to finish on another example, take Netflix. For years we've been talking about how Netflix is nearly invincible in this. Initially it was renting the DVDs, and then it was streaming, and now it's streaming in original content. Well, guess what? Everybody else is in the streaming game now. So you've got ESPN, a part of Disney. You've got Disney Plus. You've got Hulu, obviously. You've got the established players. You've got HBO. And the question really now comes to, well, at some point, the consumer is going to get fed up with this. There's only so many streaming services I want or can afford. And so there'll be the need for some kind of other aggregation to come along. And, we may yet see the resurgence of a different kind of model similar to what the cable companies do. 500 channels of which you want 3. So again, We'll see that pattern where somebody demonstrates as a demand or a need, somebody rushes in to fill it, and then everybody else piles in and copies.
Right. At one point you said, and that is interesting for our listeners because a lot of councils talk about change management. It's a big subject. It's an evergreen subject for conferences, consulting sessions, etc. And you say change management is not the right approach. Change management should be constant. It should be fluid. In your latest book, you pick this up again, and you talk about ways people, or rather organizations and leadership, can bring in the kind of multiple perspectives and experimentation to create that fluidity and be at the cutting edge. Can you talk a little bit about specific things leaders can do to allow this fluidity, or stop doing, actually?
Well, I think the model for leadership has really changed. And so, but what I say in the new book is, change, or the need for change, doesn't present itself neatly at your conference table at headquarters. It happens out there at the edges of the organization. So one of the things I think leaders constantly need to be putting an emphasis on is how do I get the insight that's out there at the edges? And when I say the edges, what I mean is, it's a scientist, right, studying the latest developments in wafer chips, or it's someone who's talking to customers who are suddenly starting to behave in a way that's a little different than what they were expecting, or it's someone, in a foreign country who's got a different technological setup, but that means people are now starting to behave in a really different way. So, for example, years ago, if you wanted to know what would happen when everybody in your country had high-speed, always-on internet access, you would go to places like South Korea, which was ahead of the rest of the world in that, and look at how people were behaving. You could do that. So I think the first principle here is leaders need to encourage a dialogue almost between what's going on at the edges of the organization and where strategic decisions are made, and that often gets overlooked. So some specific practices would be things like having a way for people to get resources that are not necessarily at the strategic center of the company. A great example of this is Adobe's Kickbox program, where anybody in the company can request a Kickbox. It comes with a candy bar and some coffee, a credit card for some coffee, some instructions for what you have to do to test out your idea, and a $1,000 gift card, which people can use pretty much to try out something that's new. Now, most of their ideas are not going to work out, but for a company the size of Adobe, $1,000 is no big deal. And they may run across something that never would have occurred to anybody in the company to pursue, because they're making those resources and that training available right at the edges of the organization. So I think there's practices like that leaders can start to fund. What's a mistake is if you centralize everything, all the decisions get made at one point by a homogenous team of people who don't have diverse experiences, and that's almost always a recipe for disaster.
Right. I understood from your previous presentations that you're not a big fan of these new business development groups or kind of formalized new business or venture teams. On the other hand, having worked at big CPG companies, it seems incredibly difficult, even with Kickbox, or we had incentive programs as well, collecting good ideas, to then do the second step, which is after you recognize there are 50, 100, maybe even 1,000 great ideas, how do you go about managing this exploding portfolio next to focusing on your core business as well and not abandoning that, as you said earlier? How do you then manage this portfolio of wild ideas and very diverse, sometimes linked to the outside groups inside your big corporation?
So I should clarify that I'm not against new venture groups at all. In fact, if you're going to make something new happen in the world, you really do need dedicated people to do that, because it's virtually impossible to have someone who's up to their eyeballs running their core business to do that. I mean, it's unrealistic to say, okay, between 2 o'clock and 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon, that's when you innovate. That doesn't add it up to a material thing. So I'm not against new venture groups at all. What I don't think is so great is the kind of innovation theater thing, right? So we send everybody off to Silicon Valley and they all come back and we have innovation boot camps. And as you said, there's 1,000 great ideas on the wall, then it has nowhere to go. So in companies that have a well-developed innovation proficiency, I'll call it, there's a governance process which has oversight over those good ideas. They have some kind of, call it a growth board or an innovation board. There's some kind of body that is entrusted with making decisions and keeping oversight over the progress of innovations. There's typically a group of people assembled to do these three things. So there's the ideation process, which is getting the great ideas. Then there's that second part you're referring to, which is the incubation process. And that really needs dedicated people, because that's going from a raw idea through the customer discovery process, through the technical feasibility, through the financial business planning, until you're at the point where you can actually now get this thing into market. And then you have a third process, which I call the acceleration process. The way to think about that is your main core business is like an 8-lane highway. And your little business is just on the on-ramp, and that's got to be brought to maturity. So you've got to pay off technical debt. You've got to pay off organizational debt. All those quick and dirty decisions you were making when you were just a venture now have to be fixed. stuff has to be brought up to industrial grade. You've got to think about compliance and legal and contracting and all those things you really don't want to be bothered with when you're just trying to figure out product market fit. So to me, the venturing groups are absolutely critical to this process, but they need to be part of a broader governance. They can't just be off on an island, ideating and thinking great things by themselves, because what ends up happening is they come back to the core business and there's tissue rejection. People just go, it wasn't my idea. I didn't think about it. I wasn't part of it. There were no connectors back to the mothership. And so it gets rejected. And so, I don't think venture groups are bad. I think they're essential. I just think they need to be managed and not the kind of way we often see it, which is, we've got a skunk works. That's where all the innovative people go. And then that often really doesn't lead to any kind of material gain.
Right. I see there are questions coming in, but I just want to remind people to put those into the questions box, not the chat box. I know it can be confusing. So we'll get to these questions in a second. Particularly if you write it into the right box, please. One thing that you reminded me of from your book as you were talking is in decision taking, you're talking about type 1 and type 2 decisions and how they should be taken differently. Can you explain what it is? It sounds like system 1 and 2 thinking.
Well, this is actually a term that Jeff Bezos uses, the CEO of Amazon. And he said, if you think about type 1 decisions, they're irreversible, they're highly risky, they're a commitment. They could have a very important consequence for the company, and they really need careful, deliberate thought. That's what he calls type 1 decisions. Type 2 decisions, on the other hand, are reversible. If you walk through the door and you decide you don't like what's on the other side, you can walk back in the door. They are low risk, relative to what your company's resources are. They don't require a huge amount of careful planning because nobody's going to get hurt if it doesn't work out the way you thought. And his argument is that what happens in too many companies is that everything gets treated like a type 1 decision. So you're filling out the same, 45-page requirement document for, a $50,000 investment in a venture that you would for a $5 million investment in a fixed asset, right? And so his argument is you try to make your decision-making structures flexible enough that not everything gets treated like a type 1 decision. And with a type 2 decision, the key thing there is to do it quickly, learn from it, get to a result as fast as you can, and then if it doesn't work out, capture the learning somehow and move on to your next idea.
Understand. Okay, let me start with the questions here. One is from Matt, and I'm not surprised by the question, which is, so thinking of all this fluidity, looking forward and pivoting, if we look at that from a brand perspective, how people look at a company as a brand image, a brand equity, is that helping or hurting a brand to need to kind of wind its way forward like this, or could it become very complex and distracting?
Well, I think there are brands that have suffered because of that, they have not figured out what their brand essence is and stuck with it. I think part of it is indeed, what is your brand? So for example, what do you keep consistent over time and what's allowed to change? So if you take something like IKEA, right, which is an incredible brand, what does IKEA stand for? I need to furnish my apartment today. It's cheap, it's well designed, it's affordable, but it's also kind of quirky and fun. And if IKEA was doing a bunch of experiments, people would say, that's fine, that fits their brand, right? That's okay. As you contrast that to something like, say, I don't know, a mutual fund brand, right? You really don't want people engaging in marketplace experimentation too much with your money. You want to know that it's going to be stable and steady and it'll be there when you come back to it. So I think one consideration is your brand a playful, pivoting, exploratory kind of brand, or is it something that doesn't get that degree of freedom? And then the second thing is, what kind of experimentation will your user, your consumer permit you to engage in? So my poster child for having dropped the ball on this would be Kraft Heinz right now. I mean, their brand stands for these iconic American products, but the consumer has basically said, look, I want less processed food. I want more good for you food. I want stuff that's in the perimeter of the grocery store, not stuff that's in the middle. I don't want things in boxes and cans. I want things that are in different form factors and so forth. And, Kraft Heinz to me, partly because people have not made investments in reinvigorating those brands, have really dropped the ball on innovation, and to the point where they're inventing silly things. I mean, they invented, for example, salad frosting, which was like a variant of ranch dressing, supposed to make salads more palatable for kids. Well, I'm not sure your consumer is going to be very enthusiastic about that kind of experimentation. So I think you need to proceed with caution when it really does touch your core brand offering and premise. That much being said, most consumers aren't like going out of their way to pay attention to what you're doing at a very minute level. So there's a lot of experimentation that you can do before people really sit up and notice.
Right. Another question here, interesting, is with all the discussion around purpose, company purpose, brand purpose, having a higher purpose than just making profits. It's been the CEO roundtable just talked about that. Does that align with what you're talking about? Can the purpose actually be a guiding light in your seeking, i.e., rather than being product or process focused as a Tesla, as a Patagonia, or other companies that are often being quoted there? If you are looking for future modes of transportation, if you're looking for helping people express their creativity, does that give you more of an opening, a guideline, a permission to do what you're actually talking about, which is look at the edges of your category, of your industry, for ways to fulfill that purpose?
I absolutely think so. And I think part of what we are perhaps at the end of is a period in which this quarterly pursuit of shareholder interests was seen as the dominant thing that any management team needed to focus on. And so you sacrifice innovation, you sacrifice investing in your people, you don't invest in upskilling, and blah, 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 blah. You offshore, you outsource, you cut costs as much as you possibly can so that you can generate as much profits as you possibly can. And I think we are at a place now where an awful lot of people are starting to question that. So if you go back to the organization sort of the 1950s, let's say, in America, these were companies that felt they had responsibilities to their community, to their people, to their customers, of course, and to their shareholders. But there was more of a balance. Now, people at that time railed against those companies being stable and stultifying, and you went and you lived your life with them. So I think that wasn't a perfect model, but I think it was a more balanced model. And, we've kind of gotten ourselves way out of balance now. And I think people are now, especially as employees and as customers skew younger, they really want to know what you stand for. Now, what you stand for can be framed fairly broadly. So, I'm here to think about the future of transportation. Or it could be framed a little bit more narrowly. I'm here to make financial services convenient and fun. But I think people are looking for something beyond just here's the features and functions of what I sell to understand what the brand really means.
Right. Here we got a question from Patricia, and she asked, of all the principles in your book, and maybe I should take this opportunity to show you the book, which one for you was the most surprising, you were not ready to find, and you consider kind of a new insight?
Well, I think the first thing that surprised me was really the spark that made me think there was room in the market for this book, which is this idea of the long cycle of what eventually feels like a sudden inflection point, that there's this sort of gradual buildup of factors that eventually reach a tipping point, and then the world is a different place. So I think that was one that really surprised me. I think something that was kind of challenging is if I take, there's a chapter in the book on Facebook. And of course, Facebook's, an incredibly successful, very smart company. They've done many, many things right. So when I really dug into their model, now remember, the research for this book has been in the works for 2 years now. So when I first started digging into their model, it was really before our current discussions with Facebook. It was just around the time, I guess maybe the Cambridge Analytica scandal was just starting to happen. And what I realized was that the ingredients for significant blind spots at Facebook were all in place. You had a pretty entrenched management team. You had a very powerful CEO with a penchant for sort of top-down direction. You had a very successful company which was basically not being honest and transparent with its users about what it was doing with all the information. And anytime you've got that kind of pattern, it's a bad signal. Now that doesn't mean that you're going to predict what happens. So I guess partly kind of to build on that, I think one of the things that surprised me about the book is you can do a lot of things right and still have a bad outcome. And you can actually make a ton of mistakes and still experience a good outcome. So I would really encourage your listeners not to see this book as predictive. It's much more about expanding your mind and being prepared for the world as it reveals itself to you, because you can't predict what's going to happen just by knowing where things start.
So this is not like a blue ocean kind of recipe book on how to develop a new market.
No, it's more, the analogy would be, it's more putting together a scenario for the future and asking yourself, is my strategy robust in the event of these different scenarios? So let's give an example of what I mean by that. So in the book, I think in chapter 2, I talk about how you can establish what I call a time zero event, something in the future that would have a material effect, either good or bad, on your business. And then building robust scenarios around that in a pretty quick way. So I talk about, you take 2 uncertainties and you take possible future values of each. And in this case, I use the energy business and I use the price of renewables versus energy demand, let's just say. And one of the scenarios that I actually talk about in the book, and remember, this was 2 years ago, was you could see a scenario where the price of renewables would be competitive with fossil fuels, and there would be, reasonably flat demand. And in a world that looked like that, right, the premium would be on companies that had a very strong position in renewable energy and that were able to, deal with distributed demand, so not big centralized power plants. Now, if that was one of the scenarios you were thinking about, right, you'd have to look at your strategy if you're an energy company or a company like General Electric that supplies the energy business. Is my strategy robust under all those scenarios? And what you saw GE doing in the sort of 2014 to 2016 period was doubling down essentially on fossil fuels. They made a big acquisition in Europe of companies that basically do servicing and provide technologies for major energy companies. Well, what happened was the price of fuels came way down. And they were committed, back to type 1 decisions, they were committed to this fossil fuel-based economic reality. Well, if they had done something like that scenario exercise, they would have seen that their strategic choices were not robust in the face of that scenario actually coming to be. So I guess what I'm saying is that you can think about, are these choices that I'm making suitable for different scenarios, or am I so confident about the way the future is going, I can afford to make an irreversible bet on it.
Right. Julia has a very funny question, but I'll get to that in a second. I want to go to another question that is kind of heavy here for the audience online, I know, which is, how do you organize for that from an HR perspective? How do you make people happy in these skunk groups when they need to eventually transition to bigger businesses, I guess, is the question here. Do HR systems and does career planning need to change in line with this flexibility?
Oh, it absolutely does. So I think one of the first issues that you alluded to is, the way a traditional company rewards people is you get to have more responsibility and run bigger groups. Well, here's the problem. If you're a blank sheet of paper, let's invent whatever it is that's going to replace smartphones kind of person, you may not want to take a job running supply chain or take a big job with lots of managerial responsibility. You may want to move to the next thing that requires fresh thinking. So one of the things I think HR is going to have to get a lot smarter about is what are the skills that people have and where are those skills going to be relevant? So as an example, let's go back to our venture teams. You want to put together a venture team. Well, how does a typical company do that today? Well, question number one is who's available? And guess what? People are available for a reason, right? Question number two is, well, who's volunteering? Who's willing to do this? Question number three is, who do I know? And none of those things are necessarily going to get you that combination of skills that's important to launching a new venture, especially as we move more towards a digital environment. So one of the things HR is going to have to start to do is be the custodian of skills and capabilities so that they know where those reside in the organization, and to be able to move people around in what I call a tour of duty context. So this was a phrase that was invented by Reid Hoffman from his wonderful book, The Alliance. And what he talks about is, he says, we don't have situations in firms where people come in the door at the age of 25 and expect to be there 40 years later. We are constructing these tours of duty. So what you want to do is construct a tour of duty for each individual that is meaningful for them, that allows them to learn, that allows them to feel that they're making a contribution to the organization. The organization, in turn, needs to commit to them for the period of that tour of duty by giving them the resources, the training, the team. And so, instead of thinking about these monolithic career ladders, you're thinking much more like a project-based organization. And if you think about it, we have, again, this is the future here today, where more of us are going to have to think. Firms like yours, firms like KPMG, firms like McKinsey, these people have been building project-based, skill-based activities for years. So there's a lot regular companies can learn from them about how to construct these HR systems that are very smart about skills, smart about development, good at moving people around where they need to be. And I think that's really where the future is going to be.
Excellent. Okay, so let me read this question. I'm not quite sure where it comes from, but you must know. Apparently, somebody said, "Oh, you're going to listen to Rita. She's the woman who said executive visits are from Fantasyland." What does that mean?
So this is one of the realities of being a very senior executive, which is, well, let me give an example. So the Gap, in 2015, made a very public announcement that they wanted to try to give their retail workers more reliable hours, which is very laudable, right? And so it was really hard for them. They have been struggling to make that a reality. And the New York Times was curious as to why this was so hard. And one of the answers was it's executive visits. And then one of the store managers was reporting, I had 2-3 shifts on extra time this whole last week because I had an executive coming to visit. So, the executive is doing what they think is the right thing, which is going out to the store, and walking around and talking to customers and so forth. But the store they're visiting is not the same store the rest of us are in, right? The store they're visiting has double the worker hours in it. It has got fresh light bulbs. It's probably been recently repainted. And, it's beautiful, but it's not reality. And so, unfortunately, the more senior you get, the harder it is to get actual information about what's going on the ground in your organization. So, you've got people that manage your calendar. They know people. The word gets out. It's just hard to be authentic and original. So as a senior leader, you've got to come up with some way of breaking through that.
Right. I guess there's a follow-up question. So this seems to be a popular theme. There's a follow-up question saying, even when I, as a manager, ask people not to prepare and just give me the straight truth, they still come with prepared PowerPoint slides. What to do?
Don't accept them. At Amazon, for example, they've banned PowerPoint. What they'll do is whoever has a proposal or an idea actually writes it up in text in a document, and they'll come together as managers in a meeting, and they'll spend the first perhaps 15 or 20 minutes literally reading the document through. And then with that background, they're prepared then to have a discussion. So, you can make it very clear you're not interested in the PowerPoints. You can start to put some real, guardrails around it. So at some companies, they'll say, okay, you can bring a PowerPoint, but no more than 3 pages. And here's the format it should take. Or you can do things that are much less formal. So, for instance, Alan Mullally, when he was at Ford, was famous there for popping into meeting rooms where he wasn't invited, and just asking people what was going on and going down into the plants and just chatting to ordinary workers. He spent a lot of time talking, for example, the press, people that covered the company, and sort of what were they hearing from employers inside the company. So I think you need to develop more sources of information and put some rules around the information that you are being given.
Okay. Joan here says one of your principles is about building diverse teams to get diverse perspectives. And you've given several examples. But she says it somehow seems that in hindsight, invariably, when there's a negative outcome, it seems to be about, oh, we should have had that person in there, or we should have done that. She says, how do you foresight to need a person expertise or experience that you can't predict you will need?
Mm-hmm. So I think part of it is giving a thought to, where could our blind spots be? Where could we be overlooking something really important? And if you think about it, if you were designing an offering, say, for a particular part of the population, let's say you were designing an offering for, I'll make this up, 15-year-old girls, right? Well, does it make any sense at all to have an all-male, all-middle-aged product development team designing products for 15-year-old girls? Of course not. And yet, that's often what we have. So I think part of what you want to be thinking about is, what is the environment that I'm designing for? And then, do I have people that know something about that environment or that are representative of that environment as part of the discussion process? For instance, I was working with a pharmaceutical group that has traditionally had, marketing and sales teams that are comprised primarily of, very well-educated, middle-class, middle-aged white men. And there was a group of these guys that went off to a customer group that services predominantly Latino, lower middle-class customers, users. And they walked in the door, and basically their client looked at them, went up and down the room and looked at them and said, "We have nothing to talk to you about. You have no way of understanding anything. Come back to us when you've got people who are more like the people we're trying to serve, or at least who are respectful of the people we're trying to serve as part of this team." So they wouldn't even meet with them. So that's an extreme example. But I think, even just putting the question on the agenda to say, do we have the right team to understand this decision, this population group, this country, this region, and being open to having people who perhaps are not normally at the table be part of those decisions is, I think, pretty critical. I think what we mix up a lot is sort of organizational hierarchy and knowledge of phenomena. We assume that the higher up you get, the wiser you are and the more that you see. And in reality, the higher up you get, the effects of your blind spots just get worse. So if you're not even asking the question, what are our blind spots? For example, the other day I was thinking about this. Women drive cars, women buy cars, women carry purses. When was the last time you got into a car where a woman was not either putting the purse in the back seat, wedging it between her knees, putting it you wouldn't design a car that way if you had to design it to accommodate a driver with a purse. And yet cars still are that way. So, it's a fascinating, everyday sort of thing of why are these things designed the way they are? It's because we don't have that need that are on the design team.
Right. It reminds me of a conversation I had just this week with an executive talking to me about the organization and how everything is well. And I said, I'm surprised because preparing for this visit, I looked at Glassdoor. And it seems to me there's quite the tension between the commercial organization and people and giving one kind of rating and feedback, and the more technical people in R&D and supply chain giving very different feedback. And he said, "Oh, really? Where did you find this?" Glassdoor. So I guess Glassdoor would be just one of those many different radar screen items where maybe they don't get physically out of the door, but a lot is possible even online today.
Oh, I think Glassdoor is a fantastic resource. I mean, if you're an executive of a company of any size and you're not paying attention to Glassdoor, you're missing a vital, valuable piece of information. I don't overreact, right? I mean, disgruntled people are more likely to post than people that are perfectly happy. We know that. And people with an axe to grind are more likely to say really negative things. We know that. But at the same time, if you're having a predominance of those kind of reviews on a site like Glassdoor and there's nobody sort of giving you the thumbs up, that's a real problem.
Right. And it might be more of a tool of getting the truth than the famous suggestion box, handing it to the VP of HR, which will then prepare a report for the CEO.
Right. That's a pretty useful exercise.
Before we let you go, Rita, I wanted to make sure everyone knows you have a fantastic blog where it news over very current themes. I think I saw a discussion on Yule. It might be the last post, actually.
It just came out today.
Can you tell us?
What I do is I do a monthly newsletter, and I do it both in text form and in video. And that goes on my website, which is ritamcgrath.com. And it also goes on to LinkedIn. And we post little excerpts on Twitter. So we try to make it as accessible as possible. And what I do each month is I take a different sector in the economy and look at what I see as some of the major inflection points that are in that sector. So we've done construction and packaging and consulting and, a whole variety of different parts of the economy. So there's an archive. If you go to my website, you'll find the archive. And there's also the blogs are listed all there.
Excellent. And it's very broad from Yule to all the way I saw in the medical bags and things of that nature with a very funny twist on what the CEO told you. I'll just use that as a teaser. So okay. It's very broad and it's a nice, it's almost like the New York Times kind of email that you want to get regularly and kind of read. So that's definitely a recommendation. I think with that, Alex is pushing here to pushing us out, actually, but gently. So I want to just personally say thank you so much, Rita. I know it's super busy time for you, and this was not easy for you to carve out. And I also want to place a teaser because we'll actually record a podcast that is purely and entirely dedicated to your new book. And again, this is the new book on our podcast, off the shelf podcast that is just about a book presentation. So if you want to dive deep into this book, then listen to that podcast at your leisure. And with that, I'll hand it back to Alex.
Thank you, JP, and thank you so much, Rita, for joining us and walking us through that really interesting stuff. Thank you to everyone who attended today. I just have a couple of final things before we go. All of the previous versions of this Marketing and Communications Center chat that we've done this year, we've been doing them since January. All of those are available in audio form as podcasts, again, under the Influencers podcast, which is available on iTunes and all your typical, and on our website, all your typical places where you get your podcasts. Now that we've changed platforms, and I'm impressed if any of you realize that we've changed platforms, but we have. This particular one with Rita today will be available as a full video webcast on demand, and that will be the case going forward as well. All of these are available on the Conference Board website at www.conferenceboard.org. You'll see on your screen here a slide for next month's Center Chat on October 31st. I hope you can join us. We'll be talking with Bob Hoffman, who's the Chief Aggravation Officer at Type A Group, about the brutal truth about social media influencers and aid agencies. I know that Bob has some very unique and disruptive thoughts in this area, so I think it'll be a really compelling and interesting conversation. So please join us. You can register for that by clicking that link on this slide, which you can download from the download pod, or you can register for the full series as well and get updates whenever we are doing a new one. Other than that, please feel free to reach out to us to let us know who you'd like to see on these podcasts and what type of topics you'd like to see. We'd love to make sure these are relevant to our audience and to give you what you're looking for. But I'm a minute over already, so I'll close it out. I'll say thank you again to Rita, JP, and everyone for joining us. please take a moment to complete the webcast evaluation here at the end, and hopefully we'll see you next month on October 31st. This has been a Conference Board webcast. Thank you.